I made a huge mistake. About a month ago, I sent a random email to Fujifilm telling them that I'm a portrait photographer and a YouTuber and asking if I could partner with them to do some gear reviews. Now, at the time, I couldn't even find an actual email address, so I sent it through their generic contact form, and I just hoped someone would get back to me. Surprisingly, the very next day, I heard from a very nice gentleman named Dan, and he agreed to basically send me whatever I wanted to try out. Okay, so that part wasn't the mistake, but I'm getting to the mistake. So I figured if they're gonna send me whatever I want, I'm gonna shoot for the stars. So I asked to check out a GFX100 with a lens and a 200mm 2.8, which is like $18,000 worth of gear, give or take a couple of $1,000. And then I didn't hear back for a few days. Now this part wasn't the mistake either, because after those few days, I did hear back from Dan and he said, we have a GFX and a 45 to 100mm lens for you to try out. Cool. But here's where I made my fatal error. So let me rewind about a year or so before I continue. So if you've been following my YouTube photography journey, you know that I've slowly moved away from using a Canon R5 as my main camera. And since I picked up an X-T5, it's pretty much become my go-to camera for all of my studio work. Canon R5 has been relegated mostly to B-roll video for my assorted YouTube videos about Fuji cameras and lenses. And even though using the cropped X-T5 sensor does have its limitations, it's really been an excellent tool for my portrait work, and I've been very happy with it until now. And here, folks, was my big mistake, my miscalculation, my error, which I now know is going to cost me a lot of money. You see, I thought that trying out a GFX100, the granddaddy of the GFX line, would be a fun experiment, a real treat, and it would make for some awesome YouTube content for you all. I also figured that since they're probably replacing it soon, it would be a great frame of reference for reviewing the new model when it's released. I thought wrong. You see, I vaguely in the past have thought about getting a GFX system, but I've always talked myself out of it for the reasons I preferred my small Fuji cameras over an R5. The cost, the size, and the fact that the full frame sensor, in my opinion, didn't provide such better results that it was worth it for someone like me who's a portrait photographer. And I figured it'd probably be the same with the medium format sensor. Well, clearly you see where this is going, because after using the GFX100 for a couple of weeks, it's clear now that everything I thought I was going to think about this camera was completely wrong. And it also means that I love, and I mean I absolutely love, this camera and the entire experience I've had using it. So let's talk some details, and I'll tell you what I really love about the camera. First, the size of the camera. I mean, it's basically a huge brick. A beautiful black and gray 100 megapixel brick. So the size, which I thought would be the biggest deterrent to me liking this camera, didn't matter nearly as much as I thought it would. Now, size is one thing, but let's talk about the camera's performance for a minute, because here is another area where I was completely shocked, especially because I figured a 100 megapixel medium format beastie like this would be slow, and I would just deal with that as part of using this very specialized system. But the autofocus is actually super fast and accurate, and I feel like it's on par with my X-T5. And saving RAW files doesn't take nearly as long as I thought it would, so even that was a lot less of an issue than I had imagined it would be going into this. Oh, did I mention it has IBIS too? And the IBIS works really, really well. For example, I was on location shooting some portraits, and I realized after taking a bunch of shots that I was shooting at 1/100th of a second handheld. And I freaked out for a second because I often get slightly soft images when shooting at this speed. But I was really surprised and happy to see that the photos were tack sharp. Even some of them at 1/80th of a second handheld, and it came out amazing. Now, on another level, using the GFX100 is very similar in experience to using any other Fuji camera, just supersized. The lens has a physical aperture dial, front command dial changes the ISO, the rear command dial changes the shutter speed. That's it, it's simple. It works pretty much like all the other Fuji cameras I've used. So I didn't even bother changing any custom dials when I first fired it up because I quickly found the eye focus on and off button after a few seconds and put it in RAW and I was good to go. And then there's the EVF and the LCD, which are just a joy to behold. Looking at these screens is like beholding a Da Vinci painting. They're just beautiful and you can see every detail. It's really something. Now, look, everything I've said up until now is part of the reason I made a mistake in testing this camera. Because after a few days, I kind of knew I was falling in love with it. But of course, I brushed it off and I ignored the warning signs and I figured I would just move on. Until I looked at and started editing the images. Now, you'll hear people say all the time, no one needs 100 megapixels. And yes, I agree with that. Outside of a very few specialized uses, you're never going to see the 100 megapixel difference. Sure, you can zoom in on the images in this camera and they are incredibly sharp and detailed. And I mean like ridiculously detailed. But this wasn't what really blew me away about the image quality. It was first the bokeh, the extremely subtle, natural bokeh taken at f4, which left me wanting more bokeh. But it's not just the bokeh, it's also the separation between the subject and the background in general, which is so much more lifelike than with a smaller sensor camera. The benefit of that larger sensor is really apparent here, and the images take on an almost 3D quality to them. Secondly, it's dynamic range. And we throw this term around a lot, but if you're a portrait photographer like me and you do a ton of color grading, this is where the dynamic range is really game changing. Now, in my portrait work, I often apply color grades or LUTs to my images. But before I start editing them, I need to flatten out the image. It's similar to shooting an F-log where the footage is really flat and lacks contrast because you plan on adding it later in post. This is how I create my dreamy portrait images. So before I export the image from Capture One, I actually lift the shadows and the curves to prep it for editing. And when I'm adding multiple layers, LUTs, and curves, I'm bringing back in all of that detail, but I'm also risking crushing the blacks in post or blowing out the highlights. So it's really a delicate balance between the way I shoot the image, leaving enough latitude for editing, which means getting the lighting really right, and then the post-production of reintroducing the shadows in post to make my final image. And here's where I've talked about, that's kind of what I felt was the main compromise of the 40 megapixel cropped sensor. But, you know, it was a compromise I made happily, and I've been very happy with the images. With the GFX, however, it's basically on a completely different level when it comes to the amount of detail you retain when you pull out the shadows or when you pull out the highlights. And my friends, this is why it was clearly a huge mistake for me ever to use this camera, because now that I've gotten a taste of the incredibly wide latitude that these files have and the insane amount of range I have from darks to lights without losing image detail, I'm not sure I can go back. So it's with a heavy heart that I must admit to you all, my loyal Fuji fans and fellow Fuji flakes, that I have a serious case of sensor envy. And now that I've gotten a taste of the GFX, I'm pretty sure it's just a matter of time before I wind up biting the bullet and getting a GFX of my very own. But until then, I'm really excited because now I can't wait to see what the replacement for the GFX100 is when it comes out, because you know it's going to be a crazy souped up version of this cool camera, and it's going to be a monumental camera. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. Hope you enjoyed this video and that it was at least mildly entertaining and informative. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, because remember, every time you subscribe to my channel, Ansel Adams gets his wings. Here's wishing you a great day, my friends. Go out and take some awesome pictures, and I'm looking so forward to seeing you in the next one. Peace.